Boccaccio's Decameron. Second day, eighth story. The ladies heaved many a sigh over the fair lady's several adventures, but who knows what their motives may have been. Perhaps some of them were sighing not so much because they felt sorry for Alatiel, but because they longed to be married no less often than she was. However, leaving this question aside, when they had all finished laughing at Pamphilio's final words, from which the queen assumed his tale to be finished, she turned to Elijah, and enjoining her to continue the proceedings with a story of her own, being only too pleased to oblige, Eliza began as follows. The field through which we are roaming today is exceedingly broad, and it would be very easy for anyone to try his skill there, not only once, but a dozen times, since fortune has stocked it so abundantly with her marvels and afflictions. But to choose a single story from among the infinite number that could be narrated, I shall begin by telling you that when the Roman imperial authority, this is the Holy Roman Empire, not the traditional Roman Empire, passed from French into German hands, the two nations became sworn enemies and made bitter and continuous war upon one another. Accordingly, in order to defend their own country and attack at the other, the King of France and his son mobilized all their kingdom's resources, including those of their friends and kinfolk, and assembled a huge army to march against their enemy. But before proceeding any further, not wishing to leave their country ungoverned, and knowing that Walter, Count of Antwerp, was a noble and intelligent man, and a most loyal friend and servant to their cause, and thinking, moreover, that although he was well skilled in the art of war, his talents would be even better employed in the subtleties of state government, they left him to rule over the whole of the kingdom of France as their viceroy, and went upon their way. And so it was that Walter settled down to the wise and orderly performance of his duties, always consulting the queen and her daughter-in-law on all matters of importance. For although they had been left under his custody and jurisdiction, he treated them, as far as possible, with the same degree of deference that he would have displayed towards his rulers and superiors. This Walter was about 40 years old, physically very handsome and agreeable and courteous a nobleman as you could ever imagine. Moreover, apart from being the most elegantly dressed, he was more refined and graceful in bearing than any other knight of his times. Now it so happened that while the King of France and his son were away at the wars we have mentioned, Walter's wife died, leaving him a widower with two small children, a boy and a girl. And whilst he was continuing to hold court with the aforesaid ladies, frequently sounding out their opinions on weighty matters of state, the wife of the king's son cast her eyes upon him, and being hugely taken with his handsome looks and agreeable manners, she fell violently and secretly in love. Considering her own unspoiled youthful appearance, and the fact that he was not tied to any woman, she thought it would be an easy matter to obtain what she wanted. And since only her shame seemed to be standing in her way, she decided to be rid of it and lay her cards on the table. So one day, finding herself alone and feeling the time to be ripe, she summoned him to her room under the pretext of discussing affairs of state. Being quite unprepared for what was to follow, the Count answered her summons without the slightest delay. Having entered the room, he found himself alone with the lady, and at her request, he sat down beside her on a sofa. He then asked her twice why she had summoned him, but each time the lady remained silent. Finally, driven on by her passion, she blushed a deep crimson, and almost on the point of tears, trembling from head to toe, she started hesitantly to speak. Sweet friend and master, dearest one of all, since you are wise, you will readily acknowledge that men and women are remarkably frail, and that for a variety of reasons, some are frailer than others. It is therefore right and proper that before an impartial judge, people of different social rank should not be punished equally for committing an identical sin. For nobody would, I think, deny that if a member of the poorer classes, obliged to earn a living through manual toil, were to surrender blindly to the promptings of love, he or she would be far more culpable than a rich and leisured lady who lacked none of the necessary means to gratify her tiniest whim. I consider then that circumstances such as these must go a long way towards excusing any woman who allows herself to be enmeshed in the toils of love, and if, in addition, she has chosen a judicious and valiant lover on whom to bestow her affection, she no longer needs any justification whatever. Now, since it is my opinion that both of these prerequisites are present in my own case, and since, moreover, I possess additional incentives for loving such as my youth and my husband's absence, they must inevitably operate in my favor and elicit your sympathy for my impetuous passion. And if they carry as much influence as they ought to carry with a man of your experience, I appeal to you for your advice and assistance. The fact is that I am unable, in my husband's absence, to withstand the promptings of the flesh and the powers of love, which are so irresistible that even the strongest of men, not to mention frail women like myself, have often succumbed to them in the past and will always continue to do so, living in the lap of luxury as I do, with nothing to occupy me. I have allowed my thoughts to dwell upon the pleasures of the senses, and fallen hopelessly in love. I realize, of course, that if this were to become known, it would be regarded as highly improper, but if it is kept secret, I can't really see any harm in it, especially since God of love has seen fit not to deprive me of my good judgment in the business of choosing a lover. On the contrary, he has greatly enhanced it by showing me that you, my Lord, are worthy in all respects to be loved by a lady in my condition. For unless I am greatly deceived, you are the most handsome, agreeable, elegant, and judicious knight to be found anywhere in the kingdom of France. And just as I can claim to be without a husband, you, for your part, are without a wife. In the name, therefore, of the immense love that I bear you, I entreat you not to deny me your own, but to take pity on my youth, which I assure you is melting away for you like ice before a fire. These last words brought such a spate of tears in their train that although she had intended to entreat him still further, she was bereft of the power of speech, and lowering her eyes, she allowed her head to fall upon his breast, weeping incessantly and very nearly swooning with emotion. Being a knight of unimpeachable loyalty, the Count began to take her severely to task for this insane passion, and to repulse the lady, who was already on the point of throwing her arms about his neck. With many an oath he declared that he would sooner allow himself to be quartered than permit any such harm to be done to his master's honor, whether by himself or anyone else. No sooner did the lady hear this than she forgot all about loving him, and flew into a savage temper. "So," she said, "am I to be spurned in this fashion by an upstart knight? It seems you want to break my heart, but I shall break yours. So, help me, God, or have you hounded off the face of the earth? So help me God, or I'll have you hounded off the face of the earth." Whereupon she ran her hands through her hair, leaving it all rumpled and disheveled, after which she tore open the front of her dress, and at the same time called out in a loud voice, "Help! Help! The Count of Antwerp is trying to ravish me." When he saw what was happening, the Count was far more concerned about the envious proclivities of the courtiers than reassured by his own clear conscience in the matter, and for this reason he feared that the lady's wicked lies would carry greater conviction than his own protestations of innocence. He therefore hurried out of the room, got quickly away from the palace, and fled to his own house, whence, without pausing for further reflection, he took horse with his children and set off at breakneck speed in direction of Calais. The lady's caterwauling brought several people running, and when they saw her and heard what she was shouting about, they were convinced she was telling the truth, more especially because they now assumed that the Count had long been exploiting his charm and his elegant ways for no other purpose. There followed a wild rush to the Count's residence with the intention of placing him under arrest. But on finding that he was not at home, they ransacked the whole of the premises and then razed them to the ground. When this story, embroidered with very obscenities, reached the king and his son in the field, they were greatly distressed and condemned the Count and his descendants to perpetual exile, promising huge rewards for his capture, dead or alive. Meanwhile, the Count, full of misgivings for having turned his innocence into apparent guilt by hurried departure, arrived at Calais with his children. Having succeeded in concealing his identity and escaping recognition, he then crossed rapidly to England and proceeded, raggedly dressed, towards London. But before entering the city, he talked at great length with the two little children, laying great stress on 2 points in particular. First, that they must patiently support the state of poverty into which, through no fault of their own, fortune had cast them along with their father. And second, that if they valued their lives, they must always be on their guard against telling anyone where they had come from or who their father was. The boy, who was called Louis, was about 9 years old, whilst the girl, whose name was Violante, was about 7, and considering their tender age, they paid the closest possible attention to their father's instructions, as they were later to prove. In order to make their task easier, the Count decided it would be necessary to change their names, and this he did, calling the boy Poirot and the girl Jeannette. On arriving in poorly dressed in London, they began to go begging for alms in the manner of French vagrants that we see here in Italy. And it was then, when they were begging outside a church one morning, that a great lady, the wife of the King of England's one of the King of England's marshals, happened to catch sight of the Count and his 2 children as she was coming away from her devotions. On asking where he came from and whether the 2 children were his, he replied that he was from Picardy and that he was indeed their father, but he had been compelled to leave home with the children and lead a vagabond existence because of a crime that an elder son of his had committed. The lady, who was of a kindly nature, ran her eyes over the girl and took a great liking to her, for she was pretty, a pretty little thing, and had an air of gentility about her. "Good sir," said the lady, "if you would like to leave this little girl with me, I will gladly look after her, for she is a pretty-looking child, and if she turns out as well as she promises, when the time comes, I shall arrange a good marriage for her." This request greatly pleased the Count, who promptly gave his consent, and with tears in his eyes he handed over his daughter, warmly commending her to the lady's care. He was well aware of the lady's identity, and now that he had found a good home for the child, he decided not to remain there any longer. And so, begging as he went, he made his way with Poirot to the other side of the island, finding the journey very tiring as he was unused to traveling on foot. Eventually he arrived in Wales, where there was another of the king's marshals, a man who lived in great style and kept a large number of servants. And to this man's castle the Count, either by himself or with his son, would frequently go in order to obtain something to eat. There were several children at the castle, of whom some belonged to the marshal himself, and others were the sons of the local gentry. And whilst they were competing with each other in children's sports like running and jumping, Poirot began to mix with them, performing equally as well or better than any of the others in every game they played. His prowess attracted the attention of the marshal, who, taking a great liking to the child's manner and general behavior, demanded to know who he was. On being told that he was the son of a pauper who sometimes came into the castle begging for alms, the marshal sent someone to ask whether he could keep him. And although it distressed him to part with the child, the Count, who was praying that such a thing might happen, willingly handed him over. Now that both his son and daughter were well bestowed, the Count decided to tarry no longer in England. So he crossed the sea to Ireland as best he could and eventually arrived in Strangford, where he entered the service of one of the feudatories of a rural baron, performing all the usual tasks of a groom or a servant, and there he remained for many years, unrecognized by anyone, and compelled to endure great hardship and discomfort. Meanwhile, Violante, who was now called Jeanette, was being brought up by the gentlewoman in London, becoming a great favorite not only of the lady and her husband, but of everyone else in the house, and indeed all those who knew her. And as she grew up, she became so beautiful that she was a marvel to behold. Nor could anyone deny, on observing how impeccably she comported herself, that she deserved all the honor and blessing that her future might bring. Since receiving the girl from her father, the gentlewoman had never succeeded in discovering anything about him apart from what he was told her. She now decided that the time had come to estimate the girl's rank as best she could and find a suitable husband. But knowing her to be a woman of gentle birth, doing penance for another's sin through no fault of her own, the Lord above, who rewards all according to their deserts, arranged matters otherwise. One must, in fact, conclude that he alone, out of his loving kindness, made possible the train of events which followed in order to prevent this nobly born maiden from falling into the hands of a commoner. Apparently, in Boccaccio's eyes, God is very much invested in the feudal system and its hierarchy. The lady with whom Jeanette was living possessed an only son. He was dearly loved by both of his parents, not only because he was their son, but also because, being an outstandingly well-bred, talented, courageous, and fine-bodied youth, he was eminently worthy of their affections. He was some 6 years older than Jeanette, and when he noticed how extremely beautiful and graceful she was becoming, he fell so deeply in love with her that he had eyes for no one else. But because he supposed her to be of low estate, he dared not ask his parents to allow him to marry her. Moreover, since he was afraid of being reproached for falling in love with a commoner, he did all he could to keep his love a secret, and thus he was afflicted with sharper pangs than any he would have suffered had he brought it into the open. Eventually, his sufferings became so acute that he fell seriously ill. A number of physicians were summoned in turn to his bedside, but in spite of carrying out test after test on one thing after another, they were unable to diagnose his ailment, and all of them despairing of finding a cure. The boy's father and mother were so weighed down with grief and worry that they almost collapsed under the strain. They begged him over and over again in tones of deep affection to tell them what was the matter. But by way of answer, he could merely sigh deeply or tell them that he had felt himself burning all over. One day he was being attended by a doctor who, though very young, was also very clever. The doctor was holding him by the wrist, taking his pulse, when Jeanette, who waited hand and foot on the invalid for his mother's sake, entered the room in which the youth was lying. When he saw her coming in, the flames of passion flared up in the young man's breast, and although he neither spoke nor moved, his pulse began to beat more strongly. The doctor noted this at once, but, concealing his surprise, he remained silent, waiting to see how long his pulse would continue to beat so rapidly. As soon as Jeanette left the room, the young man's pulse returned to normal, whereupon the doctor concluded that he was halfway towards solving the mystery of the youth's illness. He waited for a while, and then, still holding his patient by the wrist, he sent for Jeanette, pretending that he wanted to ask her a question. She came at once, and no sooner did she enter the room than the youth's pulse began to race all over again, and when she departed, it subsided. The doctor was therefore fully confirmed in his suspicions, and having risen to his feet, he took the youth's parents aside, saying, "Your son's health cannot be restored by any doctor, for it rests in the hands of Jeanette. As I have discovered through certain unmistakable symptoms, the young man is ardently in love with her, though, as far as I can tell, she herself is unaware of the fact. But you will now know what measures to apply if you want him to recover." On hearing this, the nobleman and his lady were greatly relieved, for at least there was now a possibility that he could be cured. But they were very disturbed at the prospect. however remote it might seem, of being forced to accept Jeanette as their daughter-in-law. So when the doctor had left, they made their way to the invalid's bedside. "My son," said the lady, "I would never have imagined you capable of desiring something and not telling your mother, especially when you could see that your health was suffering. Through not having what you wanted, you may be quite sure, indeed, you should have known all along that I would do anything to make you happy, even if it meant stretching the rules a little. However, since you have refused to take me into your confidence, our Heavenly Father has seen fit to intervene on your behalf, thus displaying more pity towards you than you were prepared to concede yourself. And so that you could not die from your malady, He has shown me the reason for this illness of yours, which turns out to be nothing more than the excessive love you bear towards some young woman or other. It was really quite unnecessary for you to feel ashamed about revealing it, for this sort of thing is perfectly natural if in someone your age. Indeed, if you were not in love, I would think very poorly of you. Do not hide things from me, my son, but acquaint me freely with all your wishes. Get rid of all the sadness and anxiety that are causing your illness and look on the bright side of things. You can be quite certain that I will move heaven and earth to see that you have whatever you need to make you happy. For your happiness means more to me than anything else in the world. Cast aside your shame and your fear and tell me what I can do to make this love of yours prosper. And if I don't put heart and soul into it and arrange matters to your liking, you can consider me the cruelest mother that ever brought a son into the world." On hearing these words, the young man was thrown into a state of confusion, but after reflecting that nobody was in a better position than his mother to procure his happiness, he conquered his embarrassment and said, "If I kept my love a secret, madam, that was only because I have noticed that most people, after reaching a certain age, try to forget that they were ever young. But now that I can see what a tolerant mother you are, not only will I not deny what you claim to have noticed, but I will tell you who the girl is, on condition that you do everything in your power to keep your promise and thus make it possible for me to recover." The lady, being overconfident in her ability to arrange things in the way she should never have even considered, willingly replied that he should feel quite free to take her fully into his confidence, for she would take immediate steps to ensure that he obtained what he wanted. "Madam," said the youth, "you find me in my present condition because of the excellent beauty and impeccable manners of our Jeanette, or rather owing to my inability to make her notice, still less reciprocate, my feelings for her, and because I never dared reveal them to a living soul. And unless you can find some means of making good the promise you have given me, you may rest assured that my days are numbered." "My poor boy," said the lady, thinking it preferable to encourage rather than reproach him. "What a thing to become so upset about. Now calm yourself and leave everything to me, because you are going to recover." Being filled with new hope, the youth very quickly showed signs of making a splendid recovery, to the immense satisfaction of his mother, who decided she would now attempt to make good her promise. So one day she took Jeanette aside and, adopting a light-hearted tone, asked her very tactfully whether she had a lover. "Oh, my lady," replied Jeanette, blushing all over, "it would not be at all proper for a poor girl like me, exiled from her home and living in another's service, to indulge in such a luxury as love." "Well," said the lady, "if you don't possess a lover, we are going to give you one, so that you can lead a merry life and enjoy your beauty to the full. It isn't right for a lovely girl like you to be without a lover." "My lady," answered Jeanette, "ever since the day you took me from my father, you have brought me up as your own daughter." Oops, pages stuck together. "And therefore I ought never to oppose any of your wishes, but I can't possibly agree to this, and I think I am right to refuse. I intend to love no man unless he is my lawful spouse, And if you wish to present me with a husband, well and good, since my sole remaining family heirloom is my honor. I am determined to safeguard and preserve it for as long as I live." Jeanette's reply seemed to present a serious obstacle to the plan the lady had devised for keeping her promise to her son, though in her heart of hearts, being a sensible woman, she greatly admired the girl's sentiments. "Come now, Jeanette," she said, "supposing His Royal Highness the King of England, who is a dashing and noble and young nobleman, wished to enjoy the love of an exquisitely beautiful girl like yourself, would you deny it to him?" To which Jeanette promptly replied, "The king could take me by force, but I would never consent freely unless his intentions were honorable." The lady, realizing how strong a character the girl possessed, pressed the matter no further, but decided to put her to the test, and so she informed her son that as soon as he was better, she would lock them in a room together so that he could try and bend her to his will, adding that it seemed undignified for her to go bowing and scraping on her son's behalf as though she were a procuress to one of her own ladies-in-waiting. The young man was not at all pleased with the idea, and his condition immediately took a severe turn for the worse. On seeing this, the lady took Jeanette into her confidence, only to find that she was more adamant than ever. So she acquainted her husband with what she had done, and although both of them thought it a grave step to take, they mutually decided to let him marry her, preferring their son to be alive with an unsuitable wife than dead without any wife at all. And after a great deal of further heart-searching, they announced their consent. This made Jeanette very happy, and she thanked God from the depths of her devout heart for not deserting her, nor, despite everything she did she once reveal that she was anyone other than a Picard's daughter. The young man recovered, married the girl, thinking himself the happiest of men, and proceeded to enjoy her to his heart's content. Meanwhile, Poirot, who had remained in Wales in the household of the King of England's Marshal, had likewise become a favorite of his lord and master. He was an outstandingly handsome and fearless youth, and there was no one in the island who could match his skills at jousts, tournaments, and other contests of arms. Everybody called him Poirot the Picard, and his fame resounded throughout the length and breadth of the country. And just as God had not forgotten his sisters, so too he showed that he had not lost sight of Poirot. For a great plague descended on the region, carrying off half the population and causing a large number of the remainder to take refuge in other parts, so that the country appeared to be totally deserted. The victims of the plague, including Poirot's master and mistress, their son, and several of his master's brothers, grandchildren, and other relatives, so that only a daughter of marriageable age survived, together with some members of the household, among them Poirot. Once the plague had abated somewhat, the young woman, knowing Poirot to be strong and capable, and having received encouragement and advice from her few surviving neighbors, made him her husband and proclaimed him master of all the goods and property she had inherited. Nor was it long before the King of England, having heard of the Marshal's death and knowing the worth of Poirot the Picard, appointed him Marshal in the dead man's place. And that, in brief, was what happened to the two innocent children of the Count of Antwerp after he was forced to abandon them. More than 18 years had elapsed since his hurried departure from Paris, when the Count, who was now an old man and still living in Ireland, having led a truly wretched life and enduring all manners of hardship, was seized by a longing to discover what had become of his children. His physical appearance, as he could see for himself, had changed beyond all recognition. But because of the years he had spent in manual toil, he felt much fitter now than when he was young and living a life of leisure. And so, very poor and badly dressed, he left the person in whose household he had served for all those years and returned to England and made for the place where he had left Poirot. Poirot's in Wales, remember, but details. Much to his delight and amazement, he discovered that his son was now a marshal and a great lord, and that he was a vigorous, fine-looking fellow, but he did not want to reveal himself before learning what had become of Jeanette. He therefore set out once more and never stopped until he had arrived in London, where he made discreet inquiries about the lady with whom he had left his daughter and the life she was now leading. On discovering that Jeanette was married to the lady's son, he almost wept for joy. And now that he had traced both his children and found them so comfortably established, he forgot about all of his earlier misfortunes. Being anxious to see her, he began to loiter near her house, and in the disguise of a pauper, until one day he was noticed by Jeanette's husband, whose name, by the way, was Jacques Lemins. Seeing how poor and decrepit he looked, Jacques took pity on the old man and ordered one of his servants to bring him into the house and provide him with something to eat for charity's sake, which the servant readily did. Jeanette had already presented Jacques with several children, of whom the eldest was no more than 8, and they were the prettiest, most delightful infants imaginable. When they saw the Count at his meal, they all gathered round and made a fuss of him, as though impelled by some mysterious instinct which told him that this was their grandfather. Knowing them to be his grandchildren, the old man began to show them his affection and fondle them, with the results that the children were unwilling to come away. However much their tutor cajoled and threatened them. Hearing the commotion, Jeanette left the room she was in, came to where the Count was sitting, and spoke sharply to the children, threatening to chastise them if they did not obey their tutor's instructions. The children began to cry, protesting that they wanted to stay with this worthy fellow who loved them more than their tutor, whereupon the lady and the Count smiled broadly at one another. The Count had risen to his feet, not in the manner of a father greeting his daughter, but rather in the role of a pauper paying his respects to a fine lady. And as soon as he set eyes upon her, his heart was filled with marvelous joy. But she never suspected for a moment who he was, either then or later, for he was thin and elderly looking, and what with his beard, his graying hair, his dark complexion, he no longer seemed the same person. But on seeing how reluctant the children were to be parted from the old man, and how dismally they wailed whenever any attempt was made to dislodge him, the lady told their tutor to leave them for the present where they were. It was while the children were playing with this worthy fellow that Jacques' father, who now loathed Jeanette, happened to return home and hear the whole story from their tutor. "Let them stay where they are," he said, "and to hell with them. It's obvious which side of the family they take after, for they are descended from a vagrant on their mother's side. It's hardly surprising that if they feel at home in a vagrant's company." The Count overheard these words and was deeply wounded, but he simply shrugged his shoulders and suffered the insult as patiently as he had borne countless others, although Jacques was displeased when he heard the children making such a fuss of the worthy fellow, or in other words, the Count. He was nevertheless so fond of them, rather than see them cry, he gave instructions that if the man was willing to stay, he should be offered some job or other in the household. The Count gladly agreed to stay, but pointed out that the only thing he was good at was looking after horses, which he had been accustomed to handling all his life. A horse was therefore allotted to him, and when he had finished grooming it, he would occupy himself with keeping the children amused. While fortune was treating the Count of Antwerp and his children in the manner we have just described, it happened that the King of France died and was succeeded by the son whose wife had been responsible for the Count's exile. The old king had negotiated a series of truces with the Germans, and now the last of these had expired, and the new king reopened hostilities with a vengeance. The King of England, having recently become a relative of his, offered him assistance in the form of a large expeditionary force under the command of his Marshal Poirot and Jacques Lemins, the son of the second Marshal. Our worthy fellow, or the Count, was a member of Jacques' contingent, for a long time serving in the army as a groom without ever being recognized, and being an able man, he made himself extremely useful by giving timely advice and performing various tasks over and above his normal duties. During the war, the Queen of France happened to fall seriously ill, and realizing instinctively that she was about to die, she repented all her sins, making a devout confession before the Archbishop of Rouen. He was famous for his excellence and saintliness. Among her other sins, she told him of the great wrong that had been perpetrated on the Count of Antwerp at her own instigation. Nor was she content solely with telling the Archbishop, but she gave a true account of the whole affair in the presence of many other gentlemen, requesting them to use their good offices with the king in order to secure the rehabilitation of the Count, if he was still alive, or if he was dead, of his children. Not long afterwards, she died and was buried with full regal honors. When the king was told about her confession, he heaved many an anguished sigh over the wrongs to which this excellent man had been so unjustly subjected. Then he issued an edict, which was published far and wide, both throughout the army and elsewhere, to the effect that he would pay substantial rewards to anyone bringing him information concerning the whereabouts of the Count of Antwerp or any of his children. Because of the queen's confession, so the edict continued, the king held him to be innocent of the charges which had led to his exile, and it was his intention not only to restore him to his former position, but to grant him still higher honors. Rumors of the announcement reached the ears of the count. He was still working as a groom, and when he had confirmed them, he went at once to Jacques and asked him to arrange a meeting with Poirot so that he could show them what the king was looking for. When all three of them had come together, the count said to Poirot, who was already thinking of announcing his identity, "Poirot, Jacques here is married to your sister and never received any dowry from her. In order, therefore, that your sister should not remain without a dowry, I propose that he alone should claim these huge rewards that the king is offering. This he will do by declaring you to be the Count of Antwerp's son, his wife to be your sister Violante, and myself to be your father, the Count of Antwerp." On hearing this, Poirot looked intently at the old man, and it dawned upon him that this was indeed his father. Dissolving into tears, he threw himself at the count's feet and embraced him, saying, "Father, what a joy it is to see you!" Jacques, having listened to the count's words and witnessed Poirot's response, was so delighted and astonished that he hardly knew where to put himself. But being convinced that it was all true and bitterly ashamed for occasionally having spoken harshly to the groom or count, he too burst into tears and sank to his knees at the old man's feet, humbly begging his pardon for all the wrongs he had done him. Whereupon the count, having first of all persuaded him to stand up again, assured him very graciously that he was forgiven. When the three of them had finished telling one another about their adventures, weeping and laughing endlessly together, Poirot and Jacques offered to supply the count with new clothes, but he could in no way be persuaded to accept them. On the contrary, he was determined that Jacques, once he had claimed the promised reward, should present him as exactly as he was, in his groom's clothing, so that the king would feel all the more ashamed for what had happened. Jacques therefore presented himself to the king along with the count and Poirot, and offered to produce the count and his children, if and when, in accordance with the terms of the edicts, the reward was forthcoming. The king promptly ordered all three portions to be displayed, making Jacques' eyes pop out with astonishment, and told him he could take away the reward whenever he had made good his offer to show him the count and his children. Jacques then turned and made way for his groom and Poirot. "My lord," he said, "here is the father and the son. The daughter, whom is my wife, is not here at present, but God willing, you will see her soon." On hearing this, the king stared at the count, and although his features were greatly altered, after surveying him at length, he none the less knew him again. Restraining his tears with an effort, he raised the count from his knees to his feet and kissed and embraced him, and after having warmly greeted Poirot, he ordered that the count should instantly be provided with all the clothes, servants, and horses and accoutrements that were proper to his noble rank. This was no sooner said than done, and moreover the king did much honor also to Poirot, and insisted on hearing a full account of his past adventures. When Jacques accepted the 3 enormous rewards for locating the Count and his children, the Count said to him, "Take away these gifts so generously endowed by His Royal Highness, and remember to tell your father that your children, who are his grandchildren, as well as mine, are not descended from a vagrants on their mother's side." Jacques took away the treasure and arranged for his wife and his mother to come to Paris. Poirot's wife came too. They all stayed with the Count to entertain them on a truly lavish scale, having been reinstated in all his lands and property, and granted higher rank than he had ever had before. Then they all obtained the Count's leave to return to their respective homes, whilst he remained to the end of his days in Paris, covering himself with ever greater glory. Now, the one thing about this that I would like to bring up is, Italy at this time was in many ways, as far as the Western world concerned, one of the most socially and economically mobile societies, where people through trade and stuff were able to change their position. But yet you see in Boccaccio a very, very, very firm respect for the medieval hierarchy, that there are different estates in the world. There are the lords and the kings and the people below them, and that people should not transit between one and the other. And you really see this brought out. That the case where Jacques will not reveal that he is in love with a woman who is not of his own social rank, even to the point where he is wasting away and dying, and his parents, for fear, are doing the same. You see this in the fact that Jacques' mother, realizing her son's desire, thinks it's much more suitable that he should just go in there, lock him in a room and he can rape her. That's much more satisfactory than the thought that he should marry someone below, his station. The fact that, in the Queen's daughter-in-law's speech to the Count, saying, it's one thing for an ordinary person to have an affair, but, God would be much more inclined to forgive someone so high up. They get those privileges. It's as God would wish. And in fact, a couple of times he says very specifically that God is very much maintaining this hierarchy. And, Boccaccio is very clear about his feelings there, at least in this story. The other interesting thing is the taking of the pulses. And the doctor, who, if you notice, he actually does perform an experiment. He's, here we are in the 13th century. He is, I think it's the 13th century, I always forget. He is basically using, 14th century, the scientific method. He makes an observation, the young man's pulse increasing, and then he devises an experiment. He calls the lady back in. Does the anomaly repeat itself? Yes, it does. He has performed an experiment and drawn a conclusion. He's literally using the scientific method in the 14th century. An interesting story on a number of levels. I hope you've enjoyed it, and have a nice day. I hope this is still recording. Sometimes it stops. Yes, it is. Yay!